Hi, we're the seniors of AP World, and this is Crash Course World History. Today we'll be talking about witches.
Witches have been portrayed in entertainment media in many forms. We usually envision the typical old lady with big nose hunched over a cauldron, or sometimes the teenager with magical hidden powers.
Mr. B, like Wizards of Waverly Place?
That's me from the past, like Wizards of Waverly Place. Antiquity's origins of witches are not drawn from the magic of Tinkerbell's fairy dust and Disney Channel writers. The only similarity is that witches were people who practiced witchcraft. They used magic spells and called upon spirits for help or to bring about change. However, most witches in history were thought to be pagans doing the devil's work, yet many were simply natural healers, or so-called wise women, whose choice of profession was misunderstood. It's unclear exactly when witches came on the historical scene, but one of the earliest records of a witch is in the Bible in the book of Samuel, chapter 1, thought to be written between 931 BC and 721 BC. It tells the story of when King Saul sought the witch of Endor to summon the dead prophet Samuel's spirit to help him defeat the Philistine army. The witch roused Samuel, who then prophesied the death of Saul and his sons. The next day, according to the Bible, Saul's sons died in battle, and Saul committed suicide. Other Old Testament verses condemn witches, such as the often cited Exodus 22:18, which says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Additional biblical passages caution against divination, chanting, or using witches to contact the dead. Even before the Common Era, people's perception of reality included those who didn't follow the commonly accepted rules of human limits. When King Saul of the Old Testament was faced with an insurmountable obstacle, he didn't turn towards the might of nations in the human realm or even the divine above. Instead, he put his fate in the hands of your unfriendly neighborhood witch. Whether it was symbolic of God's retribution or simply the ill will of a ratchet Endorian hag scorned by society, Saul and his sons paid a price for attempting to best the natural laws of humanity and the promise of faith to a monotheistic God. Enemies of organized religion since the beginning, witches were condemned to be enemies of society as well. Throughout history, the dynamic would be used to justify the persecution of those who fell out of line with the societal norms and accepted customs. Unfortunately for females, these proclaimed witches were commonly women, which reflects the patriarchal history of the world.
Mr. B! What about Harry Potter?
Yes, Zach. In history, there were instances of men as warlocks and male wizards. These examples in history were distinct in contrast to female witches.
Now to our thought bubble. If we look at periods of mass witch hysteria in history, we come across some common threads, namely that poverty and socioeconomic tensions tend to boil over into frustration and violence, targeting vulnerable or envied community members. When witch hunts peaked in Europe in the mid-1400s, epidemics, natural disasters, and the Protestant Reformation had brought about the collapse of a stable worldview. The impression that witches were disturbers of the peace, destructors of property, and killers of animals and people made them obvious targets in such a turbulent time. The hysteria did not die out until the recognition of religious pluralism with the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, bringing about a renewed sense of stability. The targets of accusations during this time period were overwhelmingly women older than 50. Perhaps because, as the individuals most independent from patriarchal norms, these women had difficulty assimilating to the medieval social matrix organized around the family unit. Or maybe because they were considered a burden on society at an economically uncertain time when a commercial ethic was increasingly replacing a communal one. This was compounded by the overwhelming perception that women were by nature instruments of Satan, and thus more susceptible to the forces of black magic. It is important to note that in countries such as Finland and France, many of the accused were men, but the men targeted were often similarly vulnerable and isolated community members. The pressures surrounding the witch hunts of the 15th century are also evident in modern witch hunts in sub-Saharan Africa, where socioeconomic pressures, coupled with natural disasters and prevailing superstitions, have led to accusations prevalent enough to give rise to entire villages of escaped accused witches. Traditional healers' high social status in African culture foments jealousy during times of political tension and economic decline, while the black market demand for body parts makes witch hunts a means of building wealth, when legitimate avenues of earning an income provide little opportunity during economic downturns. Similarly, in India, where over 2,500 accused witches have been chased, tortured, and killed between 2000 and 2016, witch hunts exploit India's caste system and patriarchal norms. Those who brand women as witches capitalize on superstition and stigmas to oust women from valuable land in regions such as Gujarat, where poor development plans have produced agricultural failures and economic inequalities between urban and rural communities. Witches are also blamed for pretty much any disaster, including rising infant mortality rates and deaths from malaria and typhoid in marginalized communities. So what have we learned from history? Well, if you are frustrated with natural disasters, economic decline, or disease, naturally blame a witch, or maybe just an old widow who could be a witch.
But perhaps this is a simplified conclusion to draw from the complex history of witchcraft. Oh, Stan, is that you? Guess it's time for the open letter. Let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Whoa, a Magic the Gathering game mat? The only game which makes witchcraft and the practice of magical miscreancy not only a viable but also a preferable pastime? An open letter to the Oracle at Delphi. Dear Oracle at Delphi, when most people think witches, they think pointy hats, striped socks, and broomsticks with remarkable aeronautical potential. Even worse, witches are generally marginalized by historians as being nothing more than scapegoats for society's anxieties, and which reflect an all-pervading patriarchy in the ancient world. So thank goodness there's you, Oracle at Delphi. You show us that creepy necromancy and dramatic divination are not always heretical qualities that justify persecution of women in times of famine. They are also qualities that give women status and power in a way that still agrees with the culture at large. I mean, people from all over the Mediterranean world would travel just to hear you speak. Even the highest elites and intellectuals were in your social circle, not despite, but because of your affinity for witchcraft. Not least of all, the lavish gifts of art and other staples of Greek culture given to you by city-states demonstrate just how much influence you wielded over patriarchal states like Athens, simply because your powers made your position culturally acceptable to them. Thanks for being the good witch of the North, or the West. Best wishes, Peter Kieran.
It's fascinating how the concept of female or male supernatural beings possessing mystical powers of nature have developed independently across the globe. Whether they're characterized to have demonic intentions or more altruistic motives, society's projection of elevated human abilities on individuals relies on its self-induced pressure and can be seen to provide answers when none are clear. If your infant daughter arrives stillborn during a year in which both your prize oxen have also passed and a blight takes out your wheat crop, wouldn't you feel more comfortable if there were someone or something you could blame for such a tragedy? Even better, you can take down your snobby neighbor who always flexed that butter churn on you as you hung up your clothes to dry. Watching her fry alive may bring a tinge of guilt, but also brings a sense of restored justice despite its validity. Or contrarily, you're faced with a Persian army marching on your homeland and are unsure how best to defend yourself and the ones you love. Turning to a witch for advice, you are instructed that a wooden wall shall not fail, and decided by a wooden wall, she meant bolstered navy. Scapegoats may be a sacrificial lamb, but also a prize sheep depending on the needs of society. Aw, I love a good play on goats.
Thanks for watching. I'll see you never. Crash Course is produced and directed by Zachary Vitale. Our script supervisor is Megan Sullivan, and the show is written by Peter Kiernan. Our graphics team is Thought Bubble, and we are ably interned by plagiaristic tendencies. Last week's phrase of the week was pepperoni please. If you want to suggest a future phrase of the week or guess at this week's, you can do so by sending a raven, which is also how you can ask questions about today's video that will be Googled by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, Natalie, please focus.